The room did not explode. It narrowed. In this hypothetical political legal scenario, a live broadcast drifts away from slogans and into something colder, where timing, documentation, and silence matter more than applause. No one is charged. Nothing is declared true. Yet, the structure of power quietly reveals itself, and the audience begins to sense how systems respond when narratives are tested rather than debated. The studio did not feel like a television set so much as a chamber designed to compress air. Lights hung low, bright but unforgiving, bleaching color out of faces and leaving only outlines, jawlines, eyelids, the thin, reflective sheen of nervous sweat. In this hypothetical scenario, the audience arrived expecting argument, maybe spectacle, maybe another loud exchange of partisan certainty. But what settled over the room instead was anticipation of a different kind, the kind that precedes a cross-examination rather than a debate. The scent of hairspray, warm electronics, and recycled air mixed into something metallic, almost clinical, as if the building itself understood that words spoken here would not be allowed to drift away without consequence. The moderator sat at the center, posture straight, notes stacked with practiced symmetry. Anderson Cooper had moderated conflicts before, wars of rhetoric, moral disputes dressed as policy conversations, but even he sensed the tonal shift as cameras rolled. This was being framed as a town hall, yet the geometry of the stage betrayed something else. Two chairs angled not toward him, but toward each other, separated by a narrow table that might as well have been a witness stand. The audience was divided cleanly, almost theatrically, left and right, each side already convinced it knew how the night would end. The first figure entered without hurry. Donald Trump did not rush the moment. He let it come to him. In this hypothetical telling, he wore the uniform he had refined over decades. Dark suit, red tie, flag pin catching the light just enough to remind viewers of its presence. He acknowledged the room with a brief wave, a point, a half-smile that suggested familiarity rather than arrogance, the confidence of someone who believed he understood television better than the building that housed it. At 78, his movements were economical, deliberate, calibrated to conserve energy and project control. He sat, adjusted his cuffs once, and looked out at the audience as if counting them, not as people, but as variables. There was a pause before the second entrance, a pause long enough to register. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped into the light with the ease of someone accustomed to being seen. In this scenario, she wore a cream blazer, tailored sharply, over a deep purple dress that caught reflections from the studio lamps. Her earrings flashed when she turned her head, small movements amplified by the cameras. She smiled, a practiced expression that balanced warmth and resolve, and the left side of the audience responded instinctively, applause rising in a quick, confident swell. This was a familiar ritual, recognition of a symbol, affirmation of a role already assigned. She took her seat, crossed her legs, adjusted the microphone. Her posture communicated readiness, even eagerness, the assurance of someone who had weathered hostile interviews and viral confrontations before. In her mind, this was another exchange, another opportunity to articulate values, to contrast visions of America, to sharpen the ideological divide in a way that favored her fluency and comfort with moral language. The script, as she understood it, was familiar. Anderson Cooper cleared his throat, the universal signal that something official was about to begin. He welcomed viewers to a special broadcast, his tone neutral, professional, careful. He spoke of confronting America's future, of difficult conversations, of respectful disagreement. The words were correct, the cadence smooth, but they landed lightly, almost ignored. Trump leaned slightly forward, hands folded, eyes on his counterpart rather than the moderator. The cameras caught it. He was not waiting to be invited into the conversation. "Anderson," he said, interrupting gently, the way one might interrupt a colleague rather than an adversary, "before we start, I just want to say something." The moderator hesitated, then nodded, a fraction of a second too late to maintain the illusion of control. Trump thanked the network, his tone polite, almost conciliatory, referencing past conflicts with a dismissive humor that drew a ripple of laughter from one side of the room. He spoke of transparency, of learning, of how important it was for the American people to understand not just what politicians say, but how systems actually work. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately, toward Ocasio-Cortez. "Alexandria," he said, testing the name as if weighing it. "Beautiful name. You look very professional tonight. Very put together." She smiled, a tight smile, and thanked him, already preparing her response, already translating the compliment into an expected prelude to criticism. Compliments in politics were rarely free. "Because," Trump continued, leaning back slightly, "we're going to be talking about money tonight. Who has it? Who spends it? And who pretends not to have it while living like they do?" The room shifted. It was subtle but perceptible, a tightening of shoulders, a recalibration of attention. This was not the language of policy disagreement, it was the language of framing. Anderson Cooper attempted to redirect, introducing the first audience question, but the rhythm had already changed. The exchange was no longer moving laterally across ideology, it was moving downward, drilling. A woman stood from the audience, wearing a shirt emblazoned with a familiar slogan. Her question, in this hypothetical, was simple, almost rehearsed, asking how Ocasio-Cortez responded to critics who claimed she did not live the values she advocated. It was a question she had answered many times before, and she began smoothly, speaking of access, of fairness, of the difference between personal comfort and systemic injustice. Her hands moved as she spoke, palms open, inviting agreement. Trump raised a finger, not sharply, but with the casual confidence of someone who knew the answer already. "Can I jump in just for a second?" he asked, though he did not wait for permission. "Because this is important." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, holding it loosely, almost carelessly. "I have receipts," he said lightly, the phrase landing with a strange duality. Humor on the surface, threat beneath. Public information, nothing secret, just context. The screens behind them lit up. Images appeared, familiar to many in the room. A white dress, bold red lettering, flashes from cameras, a gala setting heavy with symbolism. The left side of the audience applauded, recognizing the moment, recalling the headlines, the commentary about protest through fashion. Ocasio-Cortez lifted her chin slightly, unbothered, even proud. Trump waited. He did not speak over the applause. He let it crest and fall, understanding that silence immediately after noise carries its own weight. When he spoke again, his voice was measured, almost admiring. "Beautiful dress," he said. "Very elegant, very expensive." He paused, just long enough for the adjective to echo. In this hypothetical telling, he did not accuse. He did not raise his voice. He asked questions, each one framed as curiosity rather than condemnation. Who designed it? What events like this represented? Who attended them? Each question was accompanied by another image, another data point, another reminder that public life is documented relentlessly, often without intention. Ocasio-Cortez responded, explaining symbolism, intention, support for marginalized designers. Her words were coherent, morally structured, familiar. Yet the rhythm was changing. Trump was not arguing against her values. He was placing them next to images and numbers, allowing contrast to do the work. He spoke of costs, of access, of environments that most Americans would never see, not as an indictment, but as an observation. "This isn't about guilt," he said softly at one point. "It's about systems, about incentives, about what happens when messaging becomes currency." Anderson Cooper shifted in his chair, sensing the imbalance, attempting to steer the conversation back toward policy. But the gravitational pull was strong. The audience was no longer listening for arguments. They were watching for reactions, for micro-expressions, for the moment when preparation gives way to improvisation. Trump leaned back, folded his hands again, and smiled. Not broadly, not triumphantly, but with the calm satisfaction of someone who believed the structure was now set. "We're just getting started," he said, almost conversationally. "And I think it's important we take our time. Rushing would miss the point." The cameras lingered on Ocasio Cortez. Her smile returned, but it was different now. Thinner, more deliberate. She nodded once, as if acknowledging a shift she could feel, but not yet fully name. In this hypothetical scenario, the audience did not yet know where the night would end. But something essential had already happened. The conversation had moved away from belief and toward consequence, away from ideology and into the mechanics of power, image, and accountability. The room, quiet now, seemed to understand it too. The shift became unmistakable once the first set of images faded from the screens. What had begun as a symbolic exchange now took on the procedural cadence of something closer to an audit. In this hypothetical scenario, Donald Trump did not press forward with accusation. He slowed down instead, an instinct honed from years of knowing that pressure applied too quickly invites escape. He leaned back, fingers interlaced, and allowed the room to breathe, forcing attention to settle rather than scatter. "Let's talk about choices," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. "Not beliefs, not intentions, just choices." The word landed with a dull thud, heavier than any slogan. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez shifted in her chair, uncrossed her legs, then crossed them again. A small tell the cameras did not miss. She nodded, signaling willingness, readiness, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the moderator, then back, recalibrating. This was not the terrain she preferred. This was not abstraction. This was inventory. Trump raised his hand, palm outward, as if to reassure her. "Nothing wrong with living well," he said. "America is built on that. I live well. I don't hide it. The issue isn't comfort. It's consistency." A faint murmur rippled through the audience. Consistency was harder to defend than ideology. It demanded alignment across time, across platforms, across unscripted moments. Trump tapped his phone again, and the monitors came alive with something less glamorous than a gala. A pricing page, sterile and utilitarian. "A Tesla," he said, not accusatory, almost conversational. "Electric vehicle, clean energy. I get it. Very on-brand." He looked at her, eyebrows slightly raised, inviting correction. She nodded. "Yes, I drive an electric car because climate matters," he finished for her, smiling. "Of course." He let another pause stretch, then zoomed in on the number displayed on the screen. "Long-range Model 3, he continued, reading aloud. $60,000, give or take, once you add taxes and fees." He shrugged lightly. "Again, nothing wrong with that. But here's where systems come in." Another document appeared, This one formatted as a table, lines and columns clean, bureaucratic. Congressional travel records, Trump said. Public information. Anyone can request it. My people did. He did not look at Ocasio-Cortez when he spoke next. He looked at the audience. New York to Washington, D.C., about 225 miles. Train ride, 3 hours, comfortable, reliable. He turned back to her. How do you usually commute? She hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. It depends on scheduling, she said carefully. It does, he agreed, which is why the pattern matters. The number appeared on screen, large and unembellished, 52 flights over 2 years. Trump did not emphasize it. He let the silence do that work. 52 flights, he repeated softly. Same route, same distance. He began doing arithmetic aloud, not theatrically, but methodically, the way an accountant might. Emissions per short-haul flight, annual averages, comparative baselines. He did not accuse hypocrisy, he constructed a ledger. The audience leaned forward, even those inclined to disagree, because the structure of the argument was difficult to interrupt without seeming evasive. Ocasio-Cortez responded, speaking of security constraints, of congressional schedules, of the imperfect realities of governance. Her words were reasonable, defensible, yet they began to stack rather than flow. Each explanation required another explanation, each qualification another clause. Trump listened, nodding, occasionally murmuring agreement. Of course, he said at one point, reality is messy. Then he tapped again. A building filled the screens now, glass, steel, sharp angles, a skyline view. This is your residence in D.C., he said, not asking. Navy Yard. Nice area. She straightened. Yes, it's close to work. It is, he agreed. And expensive. He read from the building's amenities list, voice neutral, almost bored. Concierge, rooftop pool, wellness center, pet spa. A spa, he repeated, glancing up. For dogs. Laughter broke out, involuntary, scattered across the room. Even Anderson Cooper looked down at his notes. Lips pressed together, fighting a smile he did not want captured on camera. Trump did not laugh. He let the sound crest and fade. 3,000 a month, Trump continued. 36,000 a year. Again, not a crime. Not immoral, but contextual. He looked directly at Ocasio-Cortez now. Your constituents, he said, voice calm. Many of them don't have wellness centers, or pet spas, or rooftop pools. They have trade-offs. She nodded quickly. That's exactly why, and that's the tension, he interrupted gently. Not between rich and poor, between message and mechanism. Another screen change. Ride logs, dates, distances. Uber and Lyft data, Trump said, leaked in a breach. Unfortunate, but public now. He highlighted a line. 3 miles, 2 hours after a climate rally. He did not editorialize. He did not mock. He simply waited. Ocasio-Cortez inhaled, then spoke, explaining time constraints, safety concerns, the impossibility of perfection. Her voice remained steady, but the cadence had changed. She was responding now, not leading. Each answer felt slightly behind the question, each sentence reactive rather than declarative. Trump nodded again. Perfection isn't the standard, he said. Pattern is. He leaned back, hands resting on his knees. Car, flights, apartment, rides, each one individually defensible, collectively illustrative. The word hung in the air. illustrative, not condemning, diagnostic. The audience was quiet now, not hostile, not celebratory, but attentive in a way that suggested recalibration. This was no longer about whether one side agreed with the other's values. It was about whether the system rewarded alignment or tolerated contradiction as long as the optics held. Anderson Cooper attempted to interject, to redirect toward policy specifics, but the gravitational center had shifted. The conversation had moved into a register where interruption felt like interference. Trump glanced at his folder, thick with documents, then closed it deliberately. "We'll get to the rest," he said. "But I want everyone to understand something first." He looked out over the audience, then back to Ocasio-Cortez. "None of this proves anything," he said. "This is hypothetical. It's illustrative. It's about how modern politics works when image becomes currency and consistency becomes optional." He paused, letting the statement settle. Ocasio-Cortez met his gaze, jaw set now, eyes alert, defensive lines beginning to form. The room was no longer waiting for a clash of ideologies. It was waiting for the next layer to be peeled back, aware now that the escalation would not come from volume, but from accumulation. The temperature of the room changed not with sound, but with gravity. What followed did not feel like escalation so much as descent, a slow movement from lifestyle and optics into something more difficult to compartmentalize. In this hypothetical construction, Donald Trump did not raise his voice or sharpen his tone. He did something more destabilizing. He softened it. "Before we go any further," he said, hands open, palms visible, "I want to be clear about something. None of this is an accusation. Nothing here is a verdict. This is a scenario, hypothetical, designed to show how systems collide with human decisions." He waited. The pause was long enough to feel intentional. "Because when we talk about systems," he continued, "eventually we have to talk about people. And when we talk about people, eventually we reach family." The word family moved through the room differently. It did not provoke applause or laughter. It provoked attention. He tapped his phone once more, but this time the images that appeared were not polished or aspirational. They were raw, uneven, poorly lit photographs of a modest home, a ceiling stained with water damage, paint peeling where moisture had crept in repeatedly, a roof visibly compromised. The audience leaned forward instinctively, as if proximity might clarify what they were seeing. Ocasio-Cortez straightened in her chair. Her hands moved to the edge of the table, fingers interlaced tightly now, knuckles pale. She did not look at Trump. She looked at the images. "These are photographs you shared publicly," Trump said quietly. "Your grandmother's home in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria." He did not rush the sentence. He let each clause settle before continuing. "You spoke about it often, about neglect, about failure, about the moral responsibility of the federal government." She nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice lower now, less performative. "That's true." "For many people," Trump said, "this wasn't politics. It was personal. They saw an elderly woman living with a damaged roof, water coming in when it rains, and they felt compelled to help." He looked down at his notes briefly, then back up. "In this hypothetical scenario, someone who disagreed with you politically started a fundraiser, a GoFundMe, not in coordination with you, not endorsed by you, just people giving money." The total appeared on screen. Just under $15,000. Trump did not comment on the number immediately. He allowed the audience to process it first. "That amount," he said finally, "according to contractors contacted later, would have been enough to fix the roof. Maybe not perfectly, but enough." The room was silent. Not tense, not angry, just still. Ocasio-Cortez inhaled. That fundraiser was politically motivated, she said carefully. It wasn't about my grandmother. It was about undermining a broader conversation. Trump nodded once. That's one interpretation. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. Here's the problem with systems, he said. They don't pause for narratives. Rain doesn't stop because a fundraiser sends the wrong message. He gestured toward the screen. In this scenario, the money was refused. The fundraiser was shut down. A statement was issued about systemic change, about not reducing a crisis to one individual story. He looked back at her. All of that may be philosophically coherent, but roofs don't respond to philosophy. A murmur moved through the audience, subdued but unmistakable. Trump did not acknowledge it. Let's talk about capacity, he continued. Your congressional disclosures, again, public, show a net worth sufficient to address this issue privately. Not extravagantly, but adequately. Ocasio-Cortez looked down at the table now. Her shoulders tightened. I didn't want to turn my family into a political prop, she said. And yet, Trump replied gently, the photos were posted. The story was told. The suffering was already part of the narrative. He paused. The difference is what happened next. He let the silence stretch again, long enough for the audience to draw its own conclusions, long enough for discomfort to bloom. In this hypothetical, he said, other organizations reached out. Local groups, nonprofits. No statements, no headlines, just offers to help. He glanced at his notes again. No response. This time, the reaction was not audible. It was visible. Faces tightened. Brows furrowed. A woman in the front row wiped at her eyes. Trump leaned back, exhaling slowly. This isn't about ideology, he said. It's about prioritization. When narrative maintenance outweighs immediate relief, the system has inverted its purpose. Ocasio-Cortez spoke again, but her voice lacked the earlier rhythm. You're simplifying a very complex situation. I am, Trump agreed, because sometimes complexity is how accountability escapes. He straightened, signaling a transition. Now, he said, let's step back from family and return to structure. He opened the folder on his lap for the first time in several minutes. The sound of paper shifting was amplified by the quiet. Campaign finance, he said, not glamorous, but foundational. A spreadsheet appeared. Lines of payments, dates, recipients. Trump did not point at them dramatically. He traced them slowly with his finger, as if following a map. In this hypothetical, he said, your campaign paid a consulting firm millions over several years. The firm belonged to someone with whom you had a personal relationship. Ocasio-Cortez's head snapped up. That's not, he raised a hand. Hypothetical, he reminded her calmly. Public filings, disclosures, patterns. He did not say the word corruption. He did not need to. He spoke instead of optics, of compliance thresholds, of how regulators interpret overlapping personal and professional interests. Campaign funds, he said, are meant to persuade voters, not subsidize lifestyles. Even the appearance of overlap triggers scrutiny. He looked at the moderator briefly, acknowledging the presence of rules without challenging them. In this scenario, he continued, investigators take notice, not because of ideology, because of math. The audience leaned in again, sensing the shift from moral argument to legal architecture. Timing matters, Trump said. When payments increase, when relationships change, when expenses align too neatly with personal benefit. He closed the folder halfway, leaving it visible. I'm not saying anything happened. I'm saying systems don't care about intentions. They care about alignment. Ocasio-Cortez responded, listing compliance reviews, internal controls, legal counsel. Her words were correct, procedural, but they landed with diminishing force. Each sentence felt like a shield raised slightly too late. Trump listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded. That's exactly what someone says when they believe the system will protect them. He leaned back again, gaze drifting briefly to the audience before returning to her. Sometimes it does, he said. Sometimes it doesn't. The room felt heavier now, as if the air itself had thickened. This was no longer about taste or symbolism. It was about thresholds, ethical, legal, emotional, and whether they had been crossed, even hypothetically. Trump folded his hands once more. We've talked about comfort. We've talked about consistency. We've talked about family. We've talked about money. He paused. Next, he said softly, we talk about monetization. The word hung there, unresolved, signaling that whatever came next would not offer relief, only culmination. The word did not need emphasis. Monetization carried its own weight. It suggested a system that did not merely tolerate contradiction, but converted it into revenue, a mechanism that rewarded attention regardless of coherence. In this hypothetical scenario, Trump did not rush into the point. He allowed the implication to settle, watching the audience recalibrate again, sensing that the terrain had shifted from ethics and law into something more corrosive. Let's talk about merchandise, he said at last, almost conversational, as if introducing a footnote rather than a centerpiece. Campaign merchandise, movement merchandise, ideology, printed and priced. The screens filled with a familiar interface, a digital storefront, clean and modern, rows of sweatshirts, t-shirts, tote bags, pins. Slogans rendered in bold fonts, colors carefully chosen to signal urgency and virtue. Trump tilted his head slightly, studying it as if encountering a case study rather than an adversary. This is impressive, he said. Very professional. Well-branded. He zoomed in on a single item, a sweatshirt. The price appeared beneath it. $58, he read aloud, then paused. For a sweatshirt that says, tax the rich. The reaction came in waves. First laughter, then something closer to disbelief, then a hush, as the irony completed its circuit. Trump did not smile. He did not need to. He simply began doing arithmetic on a whiteboard that had been rolled discreetly to the side, the numbers appearing one by one, legible, unavoidable. Manufacturing cost, markup, margin. This isn't unusual, he said. Luxury brands do this all the time. High margins, emotional attachment, identity signaling. He underlined the final number. What's unusual, he continued, is presenting this as resistance rather than commerce. Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward now, elbows on the table, hands clasped tightly. Those funds support organizing, she said quickly. Grassroots movements require resources. They do, Trump agreed. And markets provide them efficiently. He stepped back from the board. The system doesn't care what you print on the fabric. It cares about conversion rates. He gestured toward the audience. People donate small amounts. They buy merch. They feel part of something. That's not exploitation by default. But when the messaging condemns the very mechanism producing the revenue, the contradiction becomes structural. He let the point sit, then shifted again, seamlessly, as if following a pre-written arc only he could see. And speaking of structure, he said, voice dropping slightly. "Let's talk about images." Another set of photographs appeared. A fence, a woman crying, hands pressed to her face. Headlines flashed briefly, then faded. The audience recognized them instantly. These were among the most circulated images of a previous political moment, seared into collective memory. In this hypothetical, Trump said, these images galvanized support. They became shorthand for moral clarity. He clicked again. Wider angles appeared. Empty pavement. No facility. No visible detainees. No guards. Just a barrier, distant from the site it was meant to represent. This, he said quietly, was a parking lot. The room inhaled collectively, the sound sharp, almost audible. He did not accuse staging outright. He did not say the word fake. He spoke instead of framing, of lens choice, of how proximity can be implied without being present. He showed timestamps, metadata, angles that suggested a brief visit, a sequence of poses, a choreography of grief designed to travel well on screens. Images are powerful, he said. They bypass analysis. They go straight to emotion. That's not inherently wrong. But when governance is replaced by optics, the system rewards performance over outcome. Ocasio-Cortez shook her head. That's not fair, she said. You're reducing genuine emotion to content. I'm describing incentives, Trump replied calmly. The system doesn't differentiate sincerity from utility. It amplifies what spreads. He returned to his seat, slower now, the performance nearly gone. Here's the metric that matters, he said. Outcomes. A final slide appeared. Legislative records. Bills introduced. Bills passed. Committees attended. Time allocations. In this hypothetical, Trump said, the numbers are modest, not zero, but not commensurate with the scale of the platform. He turned to face her fully. You have one of the largest audiences in American politics. Millions of followers, documentaries, covers, influence. He paused. And yet the measurable impact within the system you operate in remains limited. The audience did not react. They did not need to. The implication was clear enough. This doesn't make you malicious, he continued. It makes you symptomatic. He stood then, moving to the center of the stage, positioning himself between the two chairs, directly beneath the lights. The posture was deliberate, almost ceremonial. There's a question, he said softly, that systems eventually force us to answer. Not on Twitter, not in speeches, but in moments like this. He looked at Ocasio-Cortez, then briefly at the audience, then back again. Who do you serve? He did not elaborate immediately. He let the silence expand, uncomfortable and heavy. I don't mean your voters, he continued, or your donors, or your followers. I mean the thing that guides your decisions when incentives collide. He took a step closer. Is it the system you're in, with all its flaws, or the image you project of standing outside it? Ocasio-Cortez swallowed. She glanced once toward the moderator, then back. I serve the people, she said, but the words arrived without their former momentum. Trump nodded slowly. That's what everyone says. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn booklet. He held it up, not theatrically, but with care. This, he said, is the framework. It's imperfect. It's been amended. It's been argued over. But it's real. He set it down gently. Loving a system doesn't mean denying its failures. It means accepting responsibility for working within it, rather than performing against it. He looked at her again. So here's the simplest question, he said. Not ideological, not rhetorical. The room felt suspended, as if the air itself had paused. Do you love this country as it is, enough to be accountable to it, or only as a canvas for what it could become? Ocasio Cortez opened her mouth, then closed it. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured, almost academic. She spoke of ideals, of aspirations, of the work yet to be done. Trump listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded once. "That's an answer," he said. "It's not a wrong one, but it explains everything we've talked about tonight." He turned slightly, addressing the cameras now. "In this hypothetical," he said, "nothing illegal has been proven. No one has been convicted. But the system has been illuminated." He gestured broadly. "When politics becomes content, when morality becomes merchandise, when suffering becomes a backdrop, the system doesn't collapse. It adapts." He picked up his papers, stacking them neatly. "And eventually," he added, "it selects." He walked toward the exit without haste. Behind him, the room remained still. No applause, no outrage, just the quiet aftermath of a structure revealed. The moderator stared down at his notes, uncertain how to transition from something that had not been a debate into whatever came next. Outside the studio, the clips would circulate, the narratives would fracture, interpretations would multiply. Some would call it unfair, others would call it overdue. But beneath the arguments, the mechanism would continue, indifferent, efficient. In this hypothetical ending, no verdict was announced. None was needed. The system had spoken in its own language, and everyone in the room understood the consequence of having heard it.